I think it's interesting though that, when you're comparing it to the Beatles, and particularly comparing how the band members get on in this documentary compared with how the Beatles get on in Get Back or Let It Be, I think it's interesting that what you're saying about maybe the Beatles could have come back and recorded an album every now and again. I think the reason why this works is because it is that completely different dynamic.
Yeah.
And obviously the answer to the question I asked at the start is that John and Paul wouldn't I think treat George the way that he wanted to be treated in the band, as an equal.
Yeah.
But also equally, I don't think Paul could have pulled together Traveling Wilburys. He had the clout to, but I don't think he would have got in Jeff and Bob and Roy Orbison and Tom Petty and been a fifth of a band as opposed to the leader of a band.
Yeah, I think even if he tried to do that kind of thing, I think everyone would have recognised that they weren't going to be an equal, like 1/5 of an equal.
Yes.
Pie? Anyway, whatever. You know what I mean.
Yes.
But I think they all would have recognised that. And yes, I don't think he would have. I don't think McCartney would really know how to do that. Like, the collaborations he has done. You think about the Elvis Costello collaboration, which worked great up to a point, and the point was when Elvis Costello started challenging him a bit too much, and then it sort of fell apart a bit,
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, it makes sense, I mean, they're all guys with egos.
The Beatles, you mean?
Yeah. But I'm sure Traveling Wilburys as well. But Traveling Wilburys all seem to leave those egos at the door and are quite happy just to be thought of as equals. And it's really nice to see George in that environment. He's so relaxed, and so easygoing, and he's just having a laugh with me. There's a nice bit in the film where Jim Keltner is he's just drumming on the fridge. He's got the fridge open. He's sort of drumming on the shelves.
Yeah, for the song "Rattled."
Yeah. And it was Dave Stewart's fridge.
Yeah.
He's I had this image in my head of like him as like an Airbnb host. And writing them a bad review because like his fridge shelves were all dented.